before we begin to introduce the panelists, I do want to invite Cristina Manzano, a friend of ours, a collaborator in this program from esglobal, esglobal and esglobal in Spanish, and she will give us the welcoming remarks and talk about her institution. Cristina. Thank you, Ken. What a pleasure to share this time with all of you, and thank you for your invitation to collaborate in this webinar. Back then, we both thought, both the CCA and esglobal, we thought it was the best topic for the moment, because from Europe, as you know, we follow closely and with a lot of concern what's taking place in Ukraine and in Europe and Spain. We're also worried the ties with Latin America, the different postures we see in Latin America regarding the war. There's a part that we would like to understand better. There's something we do not agree with. And there's something that we believe that as a global community we have to build together. So that's why we thought that this debate would be so interesting for everybody to get to know the different postures and to get to know them better. It also transcends possibly what's happening in Ukraine itself and the postures of each country, because we have a very extensive debate. If Latin America is part of this dispute, and if this dispute is between the West and the rest, and what is the rest? So there are many questions that can rise from this webinar. I think it will be very interesting. And surely there are other things that will be touched on in the future. But Ken, let's begin with the questions and introduce our guests. Thank you, Cristina. Cristina has two roles here, a moderator and a panelist as well. So she's going to have two hats here with us today, and it's always great to have you, Cristina. So let me introduce the panelists. We have Benedicte. She's a professor from the Development Center and the Environment from the University of Oslo, and also an author of a book, Latin America and the New Global Order. Cristina, who we just introduced her, Gabriel Silva, a former Chancellor and Minister of Defense of Colombia in the States, and founder of the newspaper Cambio Colombia, and Rodolfo Novoa, former President and Chancellor of Uruguay. Welcome to you all, and thank you again for being with us. Gabriel, I think we begin with you. Could you please talk about the thoughts, the currents in Latin America about Ukraine and the posture that each of the countries or the region has over this conflict? Okay, I'd like to greet the audience and the colleagues of my panel. And Ken, thank you for your invitation. Latin America truly is a conceptual invention. It's not a political reality. It's a conceptual invention because historically, the external policies or foreign policies of the countries and group of countries has been so different that it's very difficult to find points of convergency in history. The points of convergency that we've seen is when there's an ideology that meets, not the region. When we had right-wing governments in Latin America, we had the same foreign policy, but now that we have some of the right and of the left, we don't have the same foreign policy because there is no ideological order in Latin America, for good or for bad. That's the reality that has characterized us in the region. Today, we have different ideological blocks. Some more pragmatic than others. We have what some call the pink wave. There's a lot of left leaders in Colombia and other countries. There's a red red wave, especially in Venezuela and Nicaragua. And so there's a big dispersion ideologically that determines everything has to do with foreign policy in the region. So the first conclusion is that there is no policy or position in Latin America with regards to the war in Ukraine. There are many positions instead. And with your question, I would say that there are fractures seen throughout Latin America. The first fracture is between the countries of the new pink wave and the rest. But among them, there are also fractures. For instance, we see a very strong position of President Petro, regarding asking for to be more neutral and to have Russia and Ukraine that's in a conflict that's almost more territorial than geopolitical. There are other positions in Chile, and surely Benedicte has seen this. They're more moderate. And there are others like those of Brazil that are more sophisticated, to give it a name. And they meet with President Biden. And they're like seniors in the region. So that's why we cannot talk about an attitude, not even a policy that's like an order throughout Latin America. But what is commonly seen in the region is that Latin America feels forgotten since the Cold War. The West, the role of the West in the Cold War made Latin America more, and the peripheries more relevant, excluding Colombia, because Colombia did have a role to play in specific bilateral things like Colombian drug trafficking in Mexico, illegal immigration. The rest of the countries feel abandoned, and that's why China has really stepped in the region strongly. And that's why the view of the US in the West has been so strong. Lastly, there are many attitudes towards the topic of Ukraine that are more for domestic audiences. So we cannot confuse what's said domestically and what's done for real and diplomatically. For instance, we see Petro at CELAC saying hard things, on tweets saying hard things. So you can interpret that he favors Russia many times, but when you see him, how the embassy is voting at the UN, it's aligned with the recommendations and suggestions of the US and Europe. So that's a preliminary vision of how things are in the region, Latin America. May I add something? Before I say something, I'd like to thank you for your invitation. And it's great to talk about the Latin American thought. And I know it's ironic because I'm from Norway, but the idea is to give you an outlook from Norway of what's happening and how we see Latin America and Ukraine. But as Ken said, at the beginning of the war, since the beginning of the war of Ukraine, I've traveled to 6 different countries. But as such, I've talked about this topic with a lot of people. And now I'm talking about the narratives that are dominating in foreign policies, as you mentioned clearly. We have to distinguish in domestic and external policies and different narratives that dominate. And one that people say Ukraine is too far away, it's not our war. And I understand that because I've been in Venezuela, I've been in Mexico. People have many other things to worry about other than the Ukraine war. And it's really understandable when we talk about people on the streets, normal people. The other narrative that I don't understand, and it's not really justifiable, is that I've seen a trend of making the war of Ukraine more relative, and that making it relative in many ways. There's a comparison with what was done by the US in Iraq, and I do think that there are similar things there. But then there is a narrative that is the war of Utah. This war has nothing to do really with Ukraine. It's a war between large powers and us. I'm talking now about Latin Americans. And that has its justification, but basically I've seen that it's an attack to a sovereign country by an imperialist country, that the Ukraine really deserve solidarity, just as other countries that have been attacked by large powers. And I believe that it's hard to really explain in the academia and Latin America. It's not that I defend that Latin America should participate with weapons in the Ukraine war, nor am I for actions. We've seen sanctions in Latin America, especially with Venezuela, but I do believe it's important to establish a narrative that really points things out clearly. We're talking about imperialist war powers. There's a history with the expansion of Jordan, but things are different now because we see here a sovereign country that's attacked and bombed strongly in a way we haven't seen, at least the last in Chechnya in 1999 to 2009. And this is something that does deserve solidarity. It deserves a narrative that puts the fate of the Ukrainians at the core, and not only the war among large powers. This is something that I see with concern. I've been talking with people in different countries in Latin America about this a lot. If you allow me, following with what you talked about the narrative, let me ask Rodolfo. Indeed, the narrative that dominates that the war is far, yes, but it does hurt everybody. There is no war that's far away in the world for anyone. And you're right. And when there are factors like those of that we see that are so important in Latin America as well. But the predominant narrative, at least here, is seen as closer. I mean, if the war hurts us, it's because of the sanctions of the US and the European Union, not because Russia is hurting or violating other countries in Europe. So my question is, how does the Russian media that has with like Sputnik and RTC, are they helping that narrative, or do we see governments that are also touched? I mean, from where do we get this narrative to make it so with so much order? Although there is no posture in Latin America in general, you can see that many countries are thinking similarly. Rodolfo, well, thank you for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you uh, and talk about these topics. I would determine that Latin America has a posture of indifference. There are strong economic interests behind this. There's no doubt about that. There is an evident proof. Zelensky wanted to have a video conference with the Mercosur, and they said no to him. So I believe in everybody in Latin America. We are aware that the aggression of Russia against Ukraine is intolerable. It violates all international law possible. The diplomacy has failed. European, North American, I have a very critical viewpoint of the diplomacy of the US because it has industries. It does have interest on the weapons industry. And in Europe, I don't see them talking about peace. I heard Morel talk in a presentation before the European Parliament, and I never heard him talk about peace or seeking negotiations, but instead there are sanctions, sanctions, and sanctions. So the war is far from no one. It would be a mistake. A human mistake can create a cataclysm. And with the news that I heard recently, China now is a mediator and it's talking about peace. I don't know what will happen, obviously, but at least there's a narrative that's changing through China. And if we look at the attitudes of Russia and the US, the idea is to place military bases everywhere, while China, after asking, of course, for anything, talks about peace. So Russia for Uruguay is not a big market, but there is no declaration in my government. We have instead talked about what we're seeing. And the truth, in Latin America, because of the differences, we're talking about 19 countries, 19 million square kilometers, 670 million in population. We have governments of the right, center, and left, and extreme left. It's very difficult to have a unity of foreign policy. Very difficult, if not impossible. And I think that what South America and Latin America has done are reasonable intents to try to have a dialogue. But today we have nothing in South America in which the presidents meet. South America really is irrelevant in the international scenario. Nobody keeps in mind the opinion of South America and even Latin America. And the US has always contributed to this division, saying America for the Americans really is America for the North American. And except a period of the president of Carter, really the Americans have backed the right-wing government and have tried to stop the left. What Kissinger said once, I don't remember to who, he said, we can't admit what's happening in Chile. The victory of Allende cannot take place. So Latin America has to find a space in which it can coordinate policies, common policies, because unless saying that there's nothing, no common ground here, and the projects of consultation that we have been sought have failed, because there's a pendulum that goes from the government, from the right wing, and then we have the left wing, new wing from the left coming in. So it really has to do with multilateral bodies. like UNASUR. UNASUR is a project that's very interesting, right? It had several defects. Unfortunately, the famous consensus that everything had to be adopted by consensus. And for me, a consensus is the dictatorship of the minority. Look at what happened in Venezuela with the nomination of the Secretary General that couldn't take place with the leadership of Venezuela. So Venezuela left UNASUR. There are countries that have left UNASUR. And this has to do with the Convention of Vienna. There are procedures to leave and to come in. Everybody had to ask for permission for the approval of the parliaments and Congress to enter UNASUR. But those that left didn't ask for any authorizations to leave. So this creates enormous difficulty, especially in the credibility of multilateral bodies or regional bodies, especially in Latin America and South America. There are many other things to say, but let's continue. Thank you. Yes, Benedict. I think that Cristina mentioned something interesting. Where does that Russian influence come from? How has it created similar narratives in different countries in Latin America? Although it is interesting to follow the Russian media in the region, but I'd like to talk about the influence in the academic world, where we've seen this influence for a long time. And for good reasons, in the academic world, we talk with everybody. And we've always so tried to include people from different sides. But there has been a trend from Russia that I would say, in many matters related to Latin America, there's a lot of agreement among Russian academics, the official narrative from Russia, and large groups of academics in Latin America. But what can't be seen, in my viewpoint, is by the Latin American academics is to understand what's the situation in Europe, in Eastern Europe. What's the relationship between Russia and the countries that around its borders? And so really, the idea here is only to criticize the US for many reasons, but this vision, anti-imperialist, you should also apply it to Russia, the situation today, and in history, as we've seen for several years. I agree with what you're saying, Benedict. I agree entirely. Thank God we are a Canadian forum, not an American forum. Gabriel, you raised your hand. Please continue with your comment. But before, I'd like to ask you as well. We talk about the difference between domestic rhetoric or those of the foreigners. And you also talked about the votes made against Russia. So my question is, Gabriel, can Latin America do something else more than just have a vote and at the UN to back the Ukrainians? What do you think about this? Oh, let me say something short about your question, data, Ken. We don't have the Gulag in operation at the UN. There is that group of Latin America and the Caribbean doesn't operate. So how can we coordinate these things because of those differences of ideology? It doesn't work, and that's reality. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Gabriel. matching with what Rodolfo says, and Gulag doesn't operate, and it's decreasing its operations for several decades now. And paradoxically, there's a big decision for the Gulag, and it's that it has the Secretary General seat of Latin America. We'll see what will happen, and we will see what will happen in this case. We will have Latin American Secretary General for the leading the Gulag, and this will lead to find the proper person that doesn't reflect only a part of Latin America, but the entire region. But following your question, Ken, I believe that for now, the only path is the bilateral way of managing positions. The multilateral, as Rodolfo said, and Benedicte already mentioned, and also Cristina has mentioned. How do you manage this bilaterally, either in Colombia or Mexico? When it comes to Colombia and Mexico, the problem is that the bilateral agenda always has a component of rivalry and controversy with the US, because we're talking about two things that are very important domestically for the US: migration and drug trafficking and violence of organized crime. Those priorities that are bilateral priorities should be regionally spread, but it's very important for the US towards Colombia and Mexico. That setting makes it very difficult for the US to reach its bilateral goals and geopolitical goals. There is a conflict that can't be solved. For instance, in the case of Colombia, there's a threat of decertifying Colombia. It's like a moral sanction that has consequences for aid and commercially as well. There's a threat of decertification for the model of drug trafficking, fighting against drug trafficking that Petro wants. And at the same time, why can't Colombia contribute to send helicopters, because we do have some in Colombia, to support Ukraine? So that schizophrenia that we see of what pushes the bilateral agenda and what geopolitically is needed by the US is a mess. If Washington asked me what to do, geopolitics is much more important than bilateral. It's better to give more autonomy and convergence and support to the agendas of each country bilaterally to have a better result geopolitically. Now, Benedicte, if you allow me to add something about what can Latin America do besides what it has done so far. To begin, I believe that it could go beyond that vote in the UN. We've heard different statements given by AMLO, by Lula, and other presidents, not all, but many that are quite neutral. Look at Lula. He said that Zelensky was guilty as much as Putin for the war. And for me, it's a mistake to say it softly. But and when it comes to sanctions, I think it's difficult to contribute to sanctions. Sometimes they're counterproductive, but there could be a way of stating some type of solidarity towards the Ukrainians. We can have humanitarian aid sent to have some humanitarian agreements as well. So the answers in Latin America is why should we do that? It's the war of NATO, but we have to keep in mind that what we also have to keep in mind that many countries in Latin America say, if you forget us in Latin America, we'll forget you. But they're forgetting many things, saying that there's a lot of solidarity, for instance, not necessarily from European countries, but there are also European movements. There are movements in Europe of the civil society and many other groups that have shown their solidarity towards Latin America during all of the wars that have been experienced in Latin America, in Colombia, Venezuela, etc. And I believe that there are failures by Europeans and by Latin Americans. And one is that you could have thought more about solidarity on both sides. One thing is to participate, for instance, with humanitarian aid and having a clear statement in favor of the part that's attacked, and not to say that you're neutral. Thank you, Benedicte. I agree with what you're saying. And it is true that most of Latin American countries did sanction the aggression from Russia to Ukraine. But later, when there was more commitment requested against Russia, many have refrained. So it's the type of neutrality that is sought actively. So with regards to peace, this is a comment that in which you can say that the European and countries do not seek peace. They do want it, but in conditions that are fair for everyone. And with the knowledge of the people that are closer, trading now in current conditions has to do with force for Russia. So that's where the community in Europe is trapped. How can you advance for peace that can be beneficial in a medium term, not only on a short-term basis, but so it won't imply to make Russia more active? And I mean, that's the big question. How can we advance in that sense? And it's true that AMLO said something very vague to advance, and then Lula, with what he said initially, has changed to relaunch the Brazilian foreign policy and to say something on the war. And my question now is, with all of the situation, this posture being neutral, not taking sides, because everybody is right in some way. There's a book of Jorge Sainz of non-alignment. So my question is it possible to have a non-alignment of Latin America in this global order that we are seeing built? Latin America is an example. Is that non-alignment possible? Okay, it's very difficult because of the conditions I set forth, of the lack of dialogue spaces that we have in Latin America. Where do presidents meet? What are the institutes to exchange ideas, not only about peace, but also about power, poverty, infrastructure, I mean, education, health? Where do they meet? How? Yes, if you allow me, this weekend they will meet in Dominican Republic with the Iberic-American Institute. That's a small step, right? Yeah, but I wish somebody could talk about this. The governments should. I participate in some forums online with other former chancellors, and we're worried about this lack of space of dialogue in America, in South America, Latin America. So it's hard for Latin America as a bloc to say, we're going to have this position. It would be great if we could do it. And as you can say, everybody wants peace, and it's better to be rich and healthy than poor and sick. But I think that there are many difficulties because of these pendulum, this volatility that we see in the governments that change. And everybody has like a revenge with the prior government. So what was done with the prior government, we have to destroy them. And then there's another government that destroys what was done by the previous government. So it's very difficult how we can, Cristina, organize a setting. I'm a pessimist in this sense. Because, I mean, Argentina will change a government, and it will be a government that left UNASUR. Lula returned, and now everybody knows that he's there. But if Brazil and Mexico, which are the two big engines or drivers of Latin America, do not change their attitude, it will be difficult that the other smaller countries will have an influence. Gabriel, what do you think? Appealing to your question and keeping in mind what Rodolfo just said, I agree that the possibility of a convergence is very remote. There are some things, but when it comes to non-alignment, really Latin America has never had a non-aligned position. It's been in different degrees of closeness or distance. I mean, from the states and other powers. I mean, there's a situation that suggests a convenience of having a non-aligned position. And it's like this dispersion of power from the states towards other players, for instance, China. And everybody has this big hope in Latin America, especially against imperialism, who we can play with somebody else that's different to the US. There's an opportunity. I hear my colleagues say this frequently, and I'm sure Rodolfo and others have heard say that China has balancing the world, and now we can have an attitude that favors the world. And I see that also more like a rhetoric, and it's unlikely because in the States, I think that the states will keep a position in which geopolitics is the fundamental driver. It wasn't until China became a power. And there's something fascinating here. How many people bet that at the end of Trump's government, the warlike attitude towards China would change with Biden? But no, at the end, since the end of the Cold War, we're seeing that both parties in the States are thinking about an existential geopolitical threat. And that changes entirely the foreign policy of the States. When we have a common enemy in a country, the actions of the States towards its tolerance to non-convergency has very, very costly actions. Indeed, we know the history of Latin America. When a government separates from the states geopolitically, when the states feels challenged, for instance, from Spain, at the beginning of the 19th century, and other countries that it considered an enemy, it had sanctions, strong sanctions, so that alignment with Europe or Spain or with continental powers would decrease ahead. When you look at the Cold War, or even during the Second World War, the same thing happened. It was very hard with the countries which had regimes that were pro Germany than others. And in Latin America, the example mentioned, when Chile began to have a situation where it took distance from the States, you could see what happened. I don't know what happens, but I wonder academically if we can study if the States still has the capability to intervene domestically in a way that it can change and force alignments as it has in the past. I think we underestimate the capacity of the States. I think that the US, sooner or later, will intervene to align the countries towards its new existential threat, which is China. May I add something? I read the book of Alanami, and it has to do with Chile. And I think it has very interesting things, but it also makes me worry. One, because that non-alignment, active non-alignment, can be a bit excessively pragmatic. Something very important about the foreign policy of Latin America has always been to respect the international law and to place the international law and human rights, everything has to do with laws and international law and human rights as a core and something that's important in its foreign policy. And most of the bilateral conflicts of Latin America, everything. I mean, we've got a bunch of experts from Latin America are strong on this and know a lot about this, but this non-alignment as being expressed now, with regards to our relations to Ukraine, really decrease the importance of all of the violations that are brutal and clear that we've seen it now. So I believe that there is an exception between the active non-alignment and international law. The other thing that I wonder is, what is an alliance? When we talk about non-alignment, for instance, Brazil is part of the BRICS, and Argentina now is applying, and Mexico also. BRICS is an alliance or not? Is it really an alliance or not? I mean, what does alliance really mean? And what does non-alliance really mean? Is it being aligning with the China and the US, or having a position towards Russia? China is part of BRICS. So where do we begin and end with this concept of alignment? Beyond that, also, I see that there's a lot of pragmatism, but there is no clear strategy of an active alignment. Instead, what I see, that a bit of everything. There's a change of power, there's a lot of uncertainty, and you see that in this ever-changing world, people feel unsafe. Brazil is trying, for instance, to become a big power, but you can see that Lula is not going he's not going to the meeting that's held in Dominican Republic, but instead he's going to China. So this is symbolic. Is this a non-alignment, or is Lula trying to position the country and trying to save the country no matter what? I mean, that's one of my concerns with this concept. And also going back to what we discussed early on, if we look at the classical non-alignment, the one of the 60s, of not having no alliances with Russia or the States, that was also based on an alliance between underdeveloped countries and strong ties with activists in other countries of different types of organizations, popular, academic. So I see this inclination of going beyond the region. And the idea that what I really see is that we have to take care of ourselves because nobody takes care of us. And everybody's trying to save themselves no matter what. And that's what I see now that's happening. I think that everybody wants to speak. Cristina, Gabriel, Rodolfo, who wants to begin? Gabriel? Would you like to make a comment about this? I'm really worried about the attitude of the US and its domestic policy with regards to the war between Russia and Ukraine, or better, the invasion, because I really believe that we're talking about a euphemism that isn't the reality. Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, there's no option there. And I would begin by saying that the US and Latin America both have not looked at the consequences that this has on international law. What do I mean? The US has never really liked to invoke international law in its international actions. It does it when it's good for it. Latin America also, despite the fact that it has used international law to defend itself when it comes to actions of other powers in the region, it has decreased its commitment. For instance, its commitment to the non-intervention of internal matters. This has weakened a lot. I see Petro opinion with a very aggressive opinion of what's happening in Peru. I see Bukele attacking President Pedro AMLO, questioning what's happening in other countries. I mean, that intervention is driven by ideology, not by national interest. And that's something very dangerous for Latin America. And it's creating very, very dangerous situations that stop the convergence when the world expects Latin America to have some coherence towards a situation, and it won't have coherence on a short-term basis at least. So it's very, very dangerous to see with the recent statement of the Governor DeSantis in the States, saying that what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is just territorial and there are no geopolitical consequences. So if you want Latin America to have a clearer, more coherent position when it comes to international law, there has to be a more sound and clear position with the US, because Russia is fragmented with the elections, and the elections will confuse others more and will make it even more difficult for Latin America to have a common ground or position. Because with the chance of having Biden reelected or President Trump or another Republican, we will see a pause in the attitudes of foreign policy. And we will see that there will be some weight or prudence to see what the US will do. I think that it will be a bad coincidence, and we will see with the US elections, we will see what will happen with the Ukraine. Then this will lead and will be the option that Latin America will use. I mean, Latin America will use those transitions to not get involved with the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Rodolfo, would you like to say something? I agree with Gabriel. I think we'll never find a common position in Latin America on aligning on one or the other side. I believe that Latin America, because in many political parties or in governments, the policy of intervention is fundamental for foreign policy as well as the peaceful resolution of controversies. And that's why it hurts. And we say that there are no wars far away, because it can hurt everybody and will hurt everybody, undoubtedly. And the ideologies that come from political parties sometimes drive these things and sometimes stop them. We're really focused on Latin America on changes of paradigms, and this also responds to an attitude of society. I mean, the society of Latin America doesn't want to reelect those that govern. I mean, there's a constant political change that, of course, creates instability, undoubtedly. Here in Uruguay, it's very clear. There are two parties, one central left, and the other is multiple parties of right and central right, and even a military party that all get together to defeat the largest party. So these matters are also influencing. And what's influencing on Latin America also is that concept of sovereignty that's quite ancient. I mean, Latin America has young countries, 200 years old only. And the sovereignty is still something only seen in phrases like, my glass is small, but I drink from my small glass. This is something that somebody from Uruguay said. My glass may be small, but I drink from it. So we're not willing in Latin America to share sovereignty, like in Europe. In Europe, sovereignty is shared. And I think it's a huge step. I mean, we're far from doing something like that. So here we see influences, for instance, elections, the ideologies, reactions of society, the concepts of sovereignty. These are elements that gather to make it even more difficult to have this chance to have a common position in terms of foreign policy and alignment or non-alignment. And if we add to this the differences that we have economically, I mean, we got Mexico with $1 billion and another country, Uruguay, with 52,000. So, or 52, I mean, the ethnical, cultural differences. I mean, I think that we have a lot of path ahead in Latin America to have something like what we see in Europe. I mean, what we see in Europe is desirable for us, but with idiosyncrasy, it's very difficult. I mean, we have to reach that, but we're far from reaching it, still very far. I would like to ask you about Europe precisely, because we see different things happening now. One is at the beginning of the invasion, you can see that there are many countries in Europe that have had to look for food and other parts from other countries. And in July this year, Spain will have the chair of the European Council. And although the European Union has underestimated its ties with Latin America, it has, now that we will have a chair that is from Spain, surely one of the priorities of these next 6 months is to have stronger ties with Latin America. There are specific matters in the agenda, is to stop with the trades with Mexico and Mercosur, but there are other things like the ones we've discussed and beyond, seeking Latin America a pattern that has to do with all of these ideas. Really what we want to see is how to have a more transversal ties. Although, for instance, climate change is something that hasn't been mentioned much, but drug trafficking and criminal gangs, things that are global. So my question for you is, do you have any expectation from this period? And what can we expect from that relation? What would you ask the European Union? Benedicte, of course, it would be great to have your opinion. I mean, you've got a leg in all these places. We're not even members. Norway isn't even a member of the European Union. Let me speak at the very end when I hear the others speak. Ken, do you remember that I had a time restriction? I have to go see my eye doctor, and I have to. I'm several miles away from the doctor's office. But let me say something shortly before I leave about Spain and Portugal's posture and their relation with Latin America. We're very close to them, and they feel close to us. I signed the treaty, the trade treaty with the European Union in 2019. I was a chancellor back then, and the ideology wasn't there because we had Bolsonaro, the chancellor of Magde Vasquez. I mean, we had all the chancellors, and we made the effort as chancellors to sign it. Then we had problems tied to the environment that France presented strongly and stopped the process of the agreement. And I hope, and I still feel the voices of France, but it wasn't inconvenient because of the Amazon, but because of the agricultural interests of France. Remember, France is the second agricultural power of the world. So I aspire, Cristina, that the chair in Europe, in the hands of Europe, will really give a good push, because it would really make us have closer ties. It would be great. That's what I expect. And I hope we can manage this. Ladies and gentlemen, what an honor to be here with you. It's been a pleasure to be with you. But the truth, I cannot miss this appointment because I have a cataract. Thank you so much, Rodolfo, for being with us. Rodolfo, thank you. Goodbye. Thank you. I'm out. So, Gabriel, Benedicte, would you like to answer? I would like to answer, despite the fact that Norway is not from the European Union and I'm not Latin America. I think it's a great opportunity, what's coming now with the chair of Spain. And it's a great opportunity. I mean, I don't know if we'll be disappointed or not. But I think it's time to have the European Union to see that Latin America can play an important role in many things. It needs Latin America as an ally, for instance, with the green transition for many other things. And that's why it's important to go to see beyond personal interests that are, of course, part of the agenda. If we do that, of course, there are different initiatives when it comes to climate change, or the Amazon Fund, which I thought it was unfair for Schultz in Latin America. It wasn't a good idea to directly state the aid with weapons, but we're talking about the Amazon Fund and other initiatives. So I think it's important for Europe now to increase its presence and its attention to Latin America overall, and to focus on things that are beneficial for both regions beyond personal interests. And this goes with Norway as well. I think that Norway has been active when it comes to have negotiations with Colombia and Venezuela, but that's basically it. I'm also the chair of Norwegian Latin American studies, and we have the same frustration. There's little attention to Latin America. And here, what we hear is things very different, and it's that Europe is only focused in the war, and the Ukraine war, and the way to get out of this is to make statements of having solidarity, aid, different initiatives, and to push and to pay attention and make sure that these take place. And I think that Europe now has a geopolitical interest in this that it didn't have before, and I think that this can help. Gabriel, if you'd like to answer, but let me ask you something else. I just read a tweet from Gabriel Boric from yesterday. He said, today we met again with President Zelensky from Ukraine, and we have a decision on CPI and to support as Chileans to provide multilateral spaces to reach the peace that's so necessary. What does Boric know that we don't know in Latin America? I mean, what does he have? I mean, there's a lot of pressure in Chile. How can he write something like this? If you allow me, Ken. It confirms what we said early on. Fractures are not among regions in Latin America, or from the ideologies of the right or the left. I think that the left in Latin America is very fragmented. We've got two cases. One is local, and it's the position of countries of that group when it comes to Nicaragua. Boric, the President Boric has spoken very hard against Nicaragua, against its violation of human rights, and against Venezuela as well. It's spoken very hard against Venezuela. So, and instead, President Petro has had an attitude that's quite tolerant to what's happening in Nicaragua, and he's been very close to President Maduro. And also, secondly, President Boric is showing a very big difference. Why? Because Chile has interests as well that are major and are giving privilege to the ideology, the interests of Chile in international trade in the Pacific Basin. Its relation with the US, Chile was, after Mexico, the second country to sign with the states a free trade agreement. And this complements with what you said, Ken, that internal or domestic policy, the role that President Boric is playing is very constructive. It could be a good example for Latin America. But unfortunately, the ideology that's stronger with the populism that we see in other countries make it very difficult to have a more sound position in Latin America. Unfortunately, I think that he's alone in the left group, in the group of the left wing in Latin America. Thank you, Gabriel. I agree with what Gabriel said, that Boric, in that sense, is a model to follow. But you can also say something else. When it comes to the interests of Chile, they're more towards China than the US. 40% of its trade is with China. China is very strong in Chile. But I think it's also relevant that Gabriel Boric comes from a social movement that's strong, and it's very much based on human rights, and that Chile has its own history. And it's got a lot of solidarity. When thousands of Chile had to leave the country because of the coup d'etat and because it was backed by the outside. So it's got this thing of solidarity for other people in times of crisis, President Boric. Cristina? Yes, we were going to talk, I think we should start answering questions. We have two questions from Jessica. One has to do with the recent visit made by Chile by Xi Jinping to Putin, and the sample of the peace plan in China. And do you think it's feasible in any way? And the other question has to do with nuclear power. The fact that the director of the organism that has to do with the power is very active with the Ukraine war, especially because of the threats, especially with the power in Russia, the attacks we've seen. And the question is, Latin American governments have had any standing regarding the use made by nuclear power by Russia in this conflict? Who, Gabriel? Yes, when it comes to the proposal of the peace plan, I believe that the US has had a wrong position. It's a priori, it's really showing its worry because of its weakened leadership than having a constructive position. And it feels marginal in an initiative that's the only one that we see underway, and not necessarily reflects the position pro-Russian, like the interpretation that the US makes. If you carefully read the statements, and if you carefully read the prudence with which some of the communiques have been made on this issue, I think it's unavailable that when it comes to the Zelensky-Xi meeting, and I think that there's something more than what the US is trying to make us see. I think that the position is pro-Russian and not neutral and not constructive, but I think that the US is mistaken. And paradoxically, what I'm seeing also is that Latin America has not given a position on this matter. Nothing real saying we're going to work with China to see what can be done with this. There is no attitude of receptivity that's extensive enough to amend or build or work on this initiative. When you are in a conflict of this type, you cannot undermine a player that's so important like Z in China. And when it comes from having a diplomatic triumph, it's almost monumental to have achieved the opening of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So you cannot demerit China's capability to cover the gaps of the US and the distrust that the US has towards China. Because remember, China provides arms, it limits its capability to be a broker for the peace in Ukraine. So I believe that Xi's plan would give Latin America a better, more constructive position. It would be great if Latin America would be great. I think that Borg is trying to play that role to contribute to the process because of its closeness as a country to China and because of its ideological convergence with that country as well. Gabriel, Benedicte, we are at the limit of our time. If you would like to give us your last comments, please. Okay, shortly or briefly, I agree with Gabriel says. I am not aware of what Latin Americans countries believe on nuclear power, but I think that we should take China's proposal seriously. Of course, if it does not weaken even more Ukraine. And we should also always listen to Ukraine. So I think it's very important that the voice of those that are the victims here should be in the middle or at the core of the conversation, or not, and not to use Ukraine to show a position in the world, a position of power that changes so much in this world. Thank you, Benedicte. Cristina, before we end, on behalf of the CCA, I'd like to thank the panelists. What a great webinar. It's been very relevant. And this won't be the last one that we hold, obviously, on topics related to this. The video of this webinar will be at our website at ccacanada.com, both in English and in Spanish. So Cristina, thank you to esglobal and to you, and you can close this meeting. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, the panelists. For me, it has been a very interesting conversation for all those that have joined us. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us as well. I think that this is a necessary setting. If something we've learned is that these webinars are great places where we can see different positions to gain closer ties and to try to understand the other parties. We've done this in this closed setting, and it's easier for us than to discuss these topics, but I think that these spaces are very necessary, and to understand in Europe what's happening in Latin America and vice versa really will help us in the future. And thank you, Canada and CCA, for making this possible. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. What a pleasure.